I am pleased to present our keynote speaker, but before I do, I want to make one quick announcement, or a couple quick announcements. First of all, someone lost a Metro card at breakfast, so if you're missing your Metro card, come find me during the break. Second thing, for those of you who weren't here during the morning, we do have a Twitter feed. If you want to follow along, if you want to ask questions on the Twitter feed, please use the hashtag Neuro-edu. That's N-E-U-R-O-E-D-U. And for those of you following along on the webcast, please use that to send questions, and we will try to get those to both our keynote speaker and to the panel as we move along. So with that, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Mariel Hardeman. She's a professor of clinical education at Johns Hopkins University and co-founder and director of the School of Education's Neuro-education initiative. And her research and publications focus on enhancing educational practices through techniques that foster innovation and creative problem solving. And today she'll tell us about why neuroeducation matters, how the science of learning influences education practices.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am really thrilled to be here. I have to tell you that on Saturday, my daughter got married, and we planned an outdoor wedding. And you all know what the weather was, right? 70% chance of thunderstorms. And we had to make a split-minute decision as to whether indoor or outdoor. Luckily, we were able to squeeze it in and have it outdoor. But people said to me, "Oh, you must be so nervous. Are you nervous?" I said, "Listen, on Wednesday, I'm going to be presenting to some of the top scientists in the country my work. A wedding, I'm not nervous." That is called nervous. So do bear with me. I mean, it is really intimidating. Oops. To be in front of the likes of Dr. Geed and Dr. Miller and Eden and all of you, Dr. Denkla. But I think this morning's conversation will be able to sort of expand on that a little bit. As Heather said, my background is in practice, and I've been at Hopkins since 2006. I have to say that really kind of coming into the area of connecting brain research with teaching and learning was really not all that new for me, in that my master's degree, way back when, was a dual degree in learning disabilities and in developmental reading. And then we knew that it was the area of neurology that actually identified that field. Before that, we thought children didn't learn to read because they didn't have the cognitive capacity. In other words, students were either retarded or normal. And learning disabilities really changed education terrifically in terms of how we viewed the learner, and we viewed children who were not reading and acquiring essential reading skills like others were, and yet were very bright. I have 5 brothers, second of 8 children, and 4 out of the 5 had learning disabilities. And it was really interesting to see someone with 140 IQ struggle so hard with learning to read. So I became very interested. You know, Martha talked about minimal brain dysfunction, and you know, the idea that there is something going on in the brain. They called it minimal then because they really didn't know what we know now and we heard so much about today. You know, so it wasn't such, with my background then and my interest in looking at the neurobiology of learning disabilities, it really was not, it was probably pretty predictable that as I moved into my doctoral studies at Johns Hopkins, that I would really focus myself on this field, and that is converging neuroscience and education. And so the Neuro-Ed initiative was designed to do that bridge, to make that connection between the large scope of sciences that we look at as brain sciences and education. And I listed here all of the many units and schools that are involved in this initiative. When I first got to Hopkins, I was amazed that there were 540 brain researchers across all of these schools. Many of them didn't know each other. So we started learning lunches where we would invite researchers to come together that were working in this space. Many of them had not even met each other. Luckily, Martha Denkla came to most of them, and I found that researchers wanted to come just to pick Martha's brain. We also found out that, you know, as a school principal, I could get parents to come to my meetings if I fed them. So I learned that feeding researchers was no different. So we provided a nice lunch, and a lot of, well, at least 3 really important studies, interdisciplinary studies, grew from this work. So this is kind of in a nutshell some of the things that we've been doing at Hopkins to bridge that. And this morning there was a lot of talk about the importance of bringing educators together with scientists, that information should not just be one way, and that scientists can learn from educators too, and really think about some translational research that way. And so again, the very first regional conference we had was Martha talking about executive function, and then you can see all of the different topics that we covered in small regional conferences. And then we held national summits. The first one was talked about this morning. We followed up. The late Bill Sapphire was thrilled that we would take the report, the Dana report, and move it to the next level. And so our first summit, Learning Arts in the Brain, brought together most of those researchers on the Dana, from the Dana Foundation report, also called Learning Arts in the Brain. And with that, we had about 300 educators and researchers. And after presentations in the morning, the afternoon was about 3 hours of roundtable discussion. And so the publication that Dana put out after that summit, Learning Arts in the Brain, was a compilation of 10 roundtable discussion groups. We had recorders at each group, and we took all of that information, not 10, I'm sorry, 30. There were 30 roundtables of 10 people each. So we pulled together discussions from those 30 tables, and the result was the book that we produced there, the monograph. Attention and engagement. Again, researchers from all over the country studying attention in a very similar format. The next one, Stress in the Brain, was co-sponsored by our School of Public Health. And that was largely focused on the biology of toxic stress and interventions, especially for children who live in poverty. Martha Farah and Clancy Blair, just a few of the people who attended that. The technology-driven brain looked at the idea of what's happening with technology. We also explored whether or not training programs, cognitive training programs, transferred to other domains of learning. And then the last one that we held was executive function in school-age children. Again, looking at the latest research on that. We then developed, we simultaneously developed academic programs. We have a certificate. It's a 5 courses, graduate certificate, Mind, Brain, and Teaching. It started out to be a regional, face-to-face, but the interest became so wide that we are an international online, and we will be starting our 8th cohort next year. Currently, we've got about 25 students from all over the world studying with us. The 5 courses span cognitive development, numeracy and literacy, neurobiology of learning differences, and that's the most popular course because, of course, Martha Denkla teaches it. That became so popular that we have now started an online Doctorate of Education program, and mind, brain, and teaching is now a specialty of that. So we have had students all over the world reading a lot of the research that some of you here have produced. We have also conducted some research, and I'm going to be sharing some of that with you. You can see there we're looking at what happens when teachers understand some of the studies that we've been talking about. I'll talk about our arts integration study, and we have a couple churning now, looking at that's an fMRI study on creativity, and then one where we're looking at salivary enzymes, mostly cortisol, and its effect on children, or its correlation with social networking and with stress and teacher efficacy. Finally, I'm going to be talking to you about a translational model that I developed about 10 years ago called brain-targeted teaching. And it is really meant to be a link between what the research is saying and what practitioners know is effective instruction. So, looking at that link, we look broadly when we talk about the brain sciences. It is certainly not just neuroscience, but now there are so many interdisciplinary fields that are much closer to education: cognitive science, right? Experimental psychology. So we draw from a wide range, I think, of research and studies to inform the brain-targeted teaching model. I called it that because when I was a student at Hopkins, one of my professors knew I had an interest in this new term, brain-based learning, and he said to me, "That's the silliest term I've ever heard. Where else does learning occur? After all, we don't think with our feet." And I responded back, "You're right. That's a really silly way to describe learning." So we know that all learning occurs in the brain, but we also know that all teaching does not result in learning. So my idea was that we look at teaching targeted to how the brain thinks and learns, ergo, brain-targeted teaching. So I don't use the term brain-based learning, never have, ever again. And then we're going to look at, effective teaching and learning. And I have to say that back in 2004, when I first introduced this model, I said to teachers, this is a model based on thinking skills framework, work like Marzano's effective instruction that works, meta-analyses of really well-researched education initiatives. And I said in the beginning, you don't really need to know the science behind it. I'm going to show you some studies that support this, but that connect with it, that inform it. But you can use the model, and I feel you're implementing a strong program of instruction if you do. About 10 years later, when the second book came out a couple years ago, I said the opposite, that I felt that it was really important that teachers understand research behind what they're doing, and especially when there's research that can inform their work. And I try to be very careful because I've worked with enough scientists who feel that there's no connection between neuroscience and education. So we know that studies that come straight out of neuroscience that can inform what teachers do is rather rare. We also know, we heard this morning where some of the best science is, and it's certainly in the area of reading instruction and in, specifically dyslexia diagnosis and validating interventions that we're seeing that are working in a behavioral way. And so I think that certainly gives us impetus to continue to do those interventions when we see biological changes as well. But the field is much wider than neuroscience, as I said. And there's a lot that needs to be done between even those laboratories. It was brought up today, and I thought Bob Slavin made a really good point. There's a recent article out by David Daniel that says something very similar, and that is that we have some great studies coming from labs, and they've been replicated over and over again, but there really haven't been randomized controlled trials in schools. So, do we want to hold a teacher or a principal accountable for using a strategy that's not really been researched in a school setting? And the answer is probably no. On the other hand, I would say that teachers should not ignore this body of research. And, you know, so what's the balance there? You know, the balance is, no, we're not going to hold you accountable because we really don't know if it works. But if we're learning about how we can mediate toxic stress through certain interventions, why should we sit on our hands and not try these out in classrooms and in schools? So, I also want to I think I agree with what I heard this morning. Teachers are intensely interested in this information, as evidenced by the number of students that we have that want to take our programs and the proliferation of these programs across universities. So they are interested. And I think it's really important that they get the information in a way that is very intentional and purposeful. We try to use the word inform what you do rather than prove, because we know we can't use that language. So, and we try to be very purposeful about when we tell teachers strategies, suggest strategies and suggest research that might inform it, that we always back it up with research studies and not just say, neuroscience says you should do this. And that's out there a lot, as you know. So one thing I would probably tell researchers that they can breathe a sigh of relief is that I have never once heard or worked with a teacher that expected a neuroscientist to tell them how to write their math lesson plan. You know, that said, I think that there are studies that can change how teachers think about what they do and think about the children in front of them. And I'm going to be sharing some of that with you. But, you know, here's one that simply, you know, busts through something that we've thought forever, and that's the IQ scores never change. And, you know, here's a study that's using both biological and behavioral measures to show that over time that IQ has changed, and brain structures associated with verbal and nonverbal functions changed as well. So I think this is sort of what I see happening in the field of education for those who I call brain research junkies. You know, they go to all the conferences, they read all the books, and I think they walk out hearing so much information, but they're not sure what to do with it once they get it back into their classrooms. In fact, there have been some studies, Paul Howard-Jones has done a few, where they've asked teachers, do you think this content is relevant? And overwhelmingly, teachers do report that this is relevant to their teaching. But a recent study asked a group of teachers who attended the Learning in the Brain conference over years, what do you do with the information? They were only very vague in their answers. So the question is, you know, do we just throw all this information at teachers and then expect them to go back into their classrooms and make sense of what to do with it? I don't think that happens much. I think the other thing that teachers face is what you see here. Similar to lots of information coming at them, in our schools, classrooms, school districts, there's a flavor of the month. You know, a lot of teachers who have been around won't even try new things because they say this too shall pass. Even brain-based learning, many thought was a new fad that would also just go away. They're hoping Common Core State Standards will just go away, some of them. But yeah, so I think that's the world of teachers, that they also have so much information that comes at them, and they just don't know how to pull it all together. One of my motivations in designing the model I did was to do just that. When I was sitting with a group of math teachers in my math department, and one of them looked at me and said, "Dr. Hardiman, do you remember mastery learning?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember. We used to do that in the early 80s, that program." He said, "Yeah, it's too bad that went away. It was really good when we used to teach kids to mastery." And I thought, oh my goodness, what is wrong with that picture? So I really felt that too much was happening, that teachers didn't know that when something new came, they didn't have to throw away the old. So I try to organize, and for us today, thinking about what we do in the field of education in buckets. You know, what are we teaching kids? Curriculum. How are we teaching kids instruction? And then have our students learned assessments. So let's look at that in more detail. Right now, what we're dealing with is the what, and Common Core State Standards. Probably everybody knows about that. In some cases, they're controversial. I don't quite know why. They're a set of performance standards that do give commonality, adopted by most states, although some are unadopting them. But those drive then content frameworks. And really, there is local control still, although some people don't believe it, because school districts are developing their own scope and sequences. So the what if teaching is determined by that. I would also say that those who are publishing textbooks are driving what teachers are teaching in schools, so we have to be very careful and very purposeful about that. And then at the end of the day, the teacher closes his or her door and teaches what she wants, or he wants, I would think. So why are we worried about the what? And here are the buzzwords that are around today. We want children to be college and career ready. That's what's driven Common Core State Standards. We always hear about the fact that we are in a democratic society, and that's true. There has to be a body of knowledge that we share so we can participate. We can't have a democratic society if we don't have an educated populace. And then finally, what really drives a lot of this, and we hear all the time, is the global economy. So at the end of the day, it's probably about making sure that no country outperforms us in the global economy. So what didn't come up today so much in this morning, and I would like to address it a bit now, is have our students learn. So testing. And we know that that's just dominated our culture. The state tests now are going to be one of two tests, largely, that will be testing Common Core State Standards. Now, I would offer to you that this is the most critical thing happening in education today because of high stakes accountability. And that is driving what is happening in our schools. And if we scratch our heads and we say, why are educators making kindergarten the new first grade? Why aren't we teaching children developmentally the way we know children are developing? And Martha has, I love when she talks about algebra too. You didn't mention that this morning, but are children all conceptually ready for algebra at maybe 10 years old? Maybe not. And certainly you heard what Martha said today about, this morning, about 5-year-olds. Well, the reason is the Stanford test is given to first graders in April, first grade. And those test scores are published in the paper. And principals are held accountable for those scores. So, do you want your kids reading by the end of kindergarten? Heck yeah. Do you want to make sure that children are sent to first grade and you know they're going to be able to read well enough to pass that test? Are more kids being held back in kindergarten or red-shirted because They're not reading like everybody else? Oh yeah. That's not being driven because the principal thinks that's the right thing to do necessarily. It's being driven because of high stakes accountability. And then we start in 3rd grade, and then that's when the real testing starts. So 1st and 2nd, reading and math scores are published in the paper. Now, what does that have to do with success? Well, again, you know, I can probably tell you how many colleagues in Baltimore accepted schools that were high-need schools, and when they didn't turn around those test scores in 2 years, they were gone. And then an outside company comes in because they can do it better. Or schools are zero-based, and all the staff are transferred someplace else. So we have been beating teachers up for a while because of this, and principals. So accountability is something that I think I've never heard teachers say that they didn't want to be accountable for their job, or that we shouldn't be telling the public how students are doing, or that parents don't have a right to know how they're doing in acquiring literacy and numeracy skills. But I think using it as a stick, and you know that Race to the Top takes us one step further in using test scores as a stick, because in Maryland, which is a Race to the Top state, teacher evaluations will be in part based on test scores. So we wonder why there's such a mismatch. Now, assessment data should be used really for instructional adjustments. That's what it was before the high stakes days. And we really want students to know what they're learning so that they can become reflective learners. So assessment's important. But I do think that we need to think through how assessment's used. And then finally, how we teach our students. Well, I think that what we want to propose is that teachers should teach students based on research-based strategies centered on the learner, that we are purposeful in using what research we know to target how students think and learn. And what we found is that when teachers do know this information, it really makes them more informed practitioners. They don't just do a strategy because they say, I'm told I have to do it this way, but they understand the why behind it. And so we found that when they know about learning and all those topics, emotion, attention, memory, executive function, creative thinking and problem solving, and they understand science behind these topics, that it does cement their practice and teaches them new things. So, what should teachers know from the brain sciences? So here's topics that we bring to them in our academic and professional development programs that I will tell you is really new to most of them. The concept of plasticity. You mean that the brain does change with experience? And the idea that we still can grow brain cells. Even scientists didn't know that 20 years ago, right? Even in current teacher preparation programs, there's probably very little that links the importance of emotions to learning. In fact, I would probably say that most teachers still believe that there's no connection between the cognitive and affective systems. I hear all the time, leave your emotions at the door. You are here to learn. And then the idea that there are windows of opportunity that even adolescents can still learn, right? And then learning and memory. There's so much research coming out now about memory systems and how memory for content can be strengthened, and I'll be sharing something about that with you. A lot of information now about physical health and learning, exercise, nutrition, sleep having an influence on learning. This morning, arts was brought up, arts and cognition. I think that there is more and more research being done on that. I'll be addressing that too. And then attention, the idea that attention can be trained and enhanced, I think is interesting to educators. And I love listening to Eric Kandel talk to teachers. This Nobel Prize winner, who, as many of you know, really informed us a lot about memory and long-term memory. I love his quote, "If you remember anything of this book, it's because your brain is slightly different after you've finished reading it." And I have heard him tell educators, when you teach children information that moves into their long-term memory system, you are changing brain chemistry. That's pretty empowering for teachers, I think. So, what should teachers know is not true about learning in the brain? Well, we do a little neuromyth quiz with teachers at the beginning of our training, and I would say that most of the myths teachers still believe. So it's really empowering for them to learn that most of this isn't true. None of this is true. That children can still learn, that they can still learn to play a musical instrument. They won't learn it as well, maybe. They can still learn a foreign language. Maybe a lot easier when you're younger. But that window doesn't slam shut completely for most things. I won't go through all these, but left-right brain, we heard that story today from, I think it was Dr. Eden that said that, about how girls were given a different reading program because the assumption was they were right-brained. I mean, that's ridiculous. The one that really jars teachers the most is that the learning style thing. That teachers should teach to each child's individual learning style. So I usually start by asking, how many of you believe that? And most people raise their hands because that's just been what they've been told. That's an example, Bob, of something that has been widely adopted in education with absolutely no empirical research behind it. So they believe it. Then I say, okay, so then if you believe that, you believe that some children learn best through the visual channel and therefore should be taught that way. And the same thing through the auditory and the same thing for kinesthetic. And they nod their heads. And then I say, raise your hand if you go home and you write 3 lesson plans every night. One for your visual learners, one for your auditory learners, and one for your kinesthetic. And they all start to laugh because they don't do that. And I said, okay, so you really don't believe it? You think you do, but you don't believe it. But I'll tell you what you probably do. You probably combine modalities. And you probably let the content drive it. So if you're teaching a math skill, you're going to be using the visual channel a whole lot. And if you're teaching foreign language, you're probably in the auditory channel quite a bit. So I think teachers naturally do what makes sense. And they're very relieved when they hear that the learning style theory is bunk. Okay, so we've been actually giving teachers training in sort of brain structure functions so that when they read Time magazine and they hear something about the hippocampus, they know what that is. Or if they read research studies, if they're in our academic programs, they are reading the studies. So we give them, background on brain structure and function. Then they're reading studies. They're reading the original studies, and they're putting it to use, again, through the brain-targeted teaching model or their own way, if they want. But they're applying it then into what they do. And they're using it to, again, I stay away from apply, inform what they do. So we started to wonder, does this really make a difference? When we go out and teachers tell us they like our professional development, or they tell us that they enjoy our certificate. Do they really need to know this? Does it make any difference in what they do in practice? So we started to look at that, and so the results of our very first cohort was one school, about 45 teachers, and so we called that cohort 1. We gave them training over the course of a school year. it was just under 20 hours of training. And again, we gave them knowledge of brain science, and then how that looks in the classroom. We did pre-post surveys. The pre-surveys were the end of August. The post-surveys were in May, when the professional development was over. Their knowledge of brain science. Then we did an attitudes survey. The attitudes, in other words, do you think that using research should inform what you do? And we did some pre-post classroom observations where we coded for certain techniques that we would be using with a sampling of teachers. It was just a small sample. And then at the very end, we did semi-structured interviews. And what we found was significant differences pre-post. On the knowledge surveys, they really retained information about that, about how the brain learns. Many of them taught it to their students. And there's a growing body of research that that really helps learning too, when students understand their own learning. We were really, I think one of the things that surprised us, we saw differences in classroom practice. The interviews were really revealing to us. It shocked me when a teacher said, was quoting a study that we had shared with them back in September, and said, that really changed my teaching. So, that's our first. We're in the process of getting that into publication. Then I was joined, when we were doing our second cohort, my postdoc did her research at UVA on teacher efficacy beliefs. And so we started to add in surveys on teacher efficacy. So we did 3 more groups of teachers, and when I say do it, we trained 3 more cohorts. The 3 cohorts were now from all over the city of Baltimore. They were all Baltimore City. Now, two of the cohorts were Baltimore City teachers, and 1 cohort was a group of our students over the summer. And so we started looking at not only what I showed you with the first cohort, but then once they get this knowledge, our idea was if teachers understand how children think and learn, does it change what they believe about what they do? So the construct coming from the research from Ben Durer, probably most of you know, is on teacher efficacy, well researched. General efficacy is, I believe, all children can learn from good teaching. And personal is, I believe I have the skills to teach it. So, again, 30 hours of training with these cohorts, and in groups, cohort 2 through 4, we measured teacher efficacy beliefs. In group 2, we didn't have a pre-test, so we used the control sample from my postdoc's dissertation. She had 600 teachers who had taken the same assessment. So we matched them to the big cohort and then to a matched sample, demographically matched sample. In groups 3 and 4, we did pre and post surveys, pre-training, post-training. So what we found, interestingly enough, is sure enough, our teachers had significant better personal teaching efficacy and general teaching efficacy after training compared to a matched sample and then the full sample both times. 10% higher assessments of personal and teacher efficacy. We also did surveys. We asked teachers, how often are you using this in practice? And here we have more than half saying they're using it every day, and then a few times a week, and then this is weekly. So either weekly, a few times a week. So we thought that was a lot. This was interesting. Improved my understanding of how students learn. There was no disagreement with that. 62% strongly agreed and 37.9% agreed. And then improved my overall practice, and you can see that that was divided between strongly agree and agree. Provided strategies that will be easy to incorporate in my practice. 79% strongly agreed, 20% agreed. This is really very interesting. Here are some examples of the efficacy survey that we gave, example questions. this is a personal teaching efficacy. When I really try, I can get through to the most difficult students. So 92% of our teachers agreed with that versus 76% of the matched control and 68%. So we think some of the research that we share with them on the interventions, especially for students who come from low SES and come in with toxic stress, that changes how they think about their work. This one, when I try, I can get through. Oh, that's the same one. Let's look at this one. If a student did not remember information I gave in a previous lesson, I would know how to increase his/her retention. Now, look at the difference here. You would think that teachers would say they know how to increase retention if a student didn't get something the first time. Less than half of the teachers in the group, 50%, were either uncertain or disagreement that they would know how to do that. But after training, 92% said they would know. So, learning some of the content that they were learning from the professional development, we think gave them the idea they would probably know how to do this. This one you want them to disagree with. A teacher is very limited in what he/she can achieve because a student's home environment is a large influence on achievement. Now we know that environment does influence achievement, but we want teachers to feel empowered, that they have something that they can do with that. Again, you see here that there was a big difference between the trained and untrained teachers. And then finally, the influence of a student's home experience can be overcome by good teaching. Huge difference here. Up to 63% of the control teachers were uncertain or disagreement that they could do anything to overcome a student's home environment, that their teaching was not going to make a difference. But 85% of the teachers that we trained felt that they could make a difference. So we think this is pretty interesting stuff. We also found that novice teachers seem to be really interesting. As we broke it down, we found that novice teachers did much better in terms of changing efficacy than career teachers. Although career teachers did too, novice teachers actually increased the most when we did pre-post. So then we started looking at this. This was research on student achievement, and this was done by a student, a doctoral student, who did a mixed method study and compared two schools, a school using this framework, that's the baseline, and a control school. And he found big differences. We were looking only at advanced reading scores on the Maryland School Assessment. So we were looking at 5th graders because they're the ones that were implementing it the most. One, I think, part of his study that I think is the most striking is that the biggest change from treatment to control are the farms kids, free and reduced meals. Here, the control school outperforms in that category, but you can see the big difference between the control and treatment school, which often, I mean, what that tells me, this is obviously not causal data, but what that tells me is that oftentimes for children or farms or children with disabilities, we drill, kill, and double dose them, rather than giving them knowledge and information. So this is the framework that we use. We use 6 areas that we call brain targets, and I'll go through them briefly with you, and then maybe we can have some discussion about what they do. So the first is letting teachers know that there is a connection between the affective and the cognitive systems. Jill Bolt-Taylor says it well in her book, A Stroke of Insight. Probably most of you know that book, yes? She was a neuroscientist who had a stroke and then wrote about her recovery. And she wrote, we think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, but biologically, we're feeling creatures that think. And so we show the teachers biologically how the system is set up and the amygdala and how it's receiving a signal, and that those signals are very important to the fight or flight response, and that stress response can be harmful, especially cortisol baths. And there's been a growing body of research on the idea of toxic stress. And certainly that is important for our teachers to know, especially for teachers who are teaching children in poverty. But for all, there's just a recent study on stress for affluent kids and how that's not terribly different. Some of them are experiencing the same kind of toxic stress through some of the pressures that they have. So here we try to, and again we get into the research of Neville and others about what SES, how SES correlates with poor attention and memory. So after they get training then in that area, we ask them to be very reflective about what they do and design instruction and just think about how that informs what they can do. And so they design learning units, and this is just a planning template that they use to be reflective in that area. The second target we talk about is the physical environment, and here we talk about novelty and how attention really can be manipulated in some way by paying attention to the physical environment. They don't need Posner to tell them that they should probably change their displays in their classrooms, but some teachers actually put everything up in September and take it all down in June and expect the kids are learning from those posters on the wall. They're not. It's like wallpaper to them, right? And so, you know, if they learn the research behind why novelty triggers alerting systems, then they're probably more purposeful about their environment. Also, they're reading research on lighting, on noise in the environment, scent, exercise, sleep. They read Jay's paper. And then we draw from some of the other philosophies that look at just order. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing less and less of is this in schools. There's a study by Tanner talking about window gazing and how attention is brought back much quicker when students are gazing at a window because it recruits less of their executive function than if they're texting or even doodling. And so why don't we let natural light into classrooms, or why don't we let students gaze out windows? This was taken just a couple weeks ago in a Baltimore City school. So they had windows, but there's also been research. I was fortunate to be at the Temporal Dynamic Learning Center, Science of Learning Center at University of California, San Diego, and heard some amazing research on vistas and how important it is for the visual system to be able to see large vistas. And so when I was a school principal, not that I knew about that research, but we knew that to open up a stairwell that was dirty and had no windows, to have, and we put those on all of the floors, to put put vistas there and bring kind of a nature and light into it, might help students. I mean, there you go. So it didn't take brain science to tell me to do that, but it's sure nice to see research that supports it. So again, here the teachers become very purposeful about some of those areas. The next target that we do is now we say, okay, we've talked about the emotional and physical environment. Now let's plan your lesson. And as you plan your lesson, let's not think objective by objective as teachers typically do. In fact, the icon there of the puzzle, you know, I will say to teachers, if you were given a jigsaw puzzle but you never saw the picture, the individual pieces wouldn't make much sense. So let's give kids big picture thinking. And here we draw on the work of many people, but Bransford is one, that we should not be thinking about knowledge as a list of facts that kids have to learn and then spit it out at the end. But how do we have children make connections with what they see? And so teachers then begin a unit by designing concept maps and then giving those maps to the students. Here we share research on visual tracking, for example. There's some really interesting studies that show that younger children actually attend to the parts, but after about 6, they attend better to the whole. And so, you know, I think that we have research from multiple fields that really support what we're saying here. There's a lot of support in even education research about the use of graphic organizers and how they help students. So here's an example of what we do. This was the first conversion of a typically taught, conventionally taught unit, and one that used this model. And here they were teaching about a novel, Hatchet, and the students then understood much more about the characters and much deeper about the story when they saw the big picture of what they were learning, how the concepts came together, what they were going to do, and then here, how they were going to be held accountable for their learning. So once again, so I'm going to move rather quickly now. Brain Target 4 is teaching for mastery. And here we say to teachers, mastery is really having children remember what they learn. So think about Lucy saying, hey, Charlie Brown, guess what? I taught Woodstock to whistle. And Charlie Brown thinks about Woodstock and says, that's funny, Woodstock can't whistle. And she says, no, stupid, I said I taught him to whistle. I didn't say he learned it. But that's what we hear in education all the time. I taught it, I didn't say they learned it. It's why the upper elementary teachers blame the lower elementary that the kids haven't learned their math facts. And it's why the middle school teachers blame the elementary teachers. And then high school teachers blame the middle. And now that I'm at higher ed, all I hear about is how high school teachers aren't preparing kids for college. But I think it's a lot about I taught it. So, you know, again, we work with teachers in learning about the brain's memory system, looking at how is memory encoded, and what does memory depend on. And I'm happy to talk about the arts now, because it was brought up today, and I think Laura Ann talked very nicely about the Dana Foundation studies that were done, and in most of those studies, they were testing children who had studied an art form rather deeply. And then various art forms were studied and reported, visual arts, mostly music, but some visual arts and some dance. And so what they found was many of them found not only near transfer, right, maybe better finger dexterity, but then also far transfer. Some reported better attention. I think Posner's work was he found differences in the attending system. I think Brian Wandell found some reading comprehension results. Liz Spelke found results in, I think it was geometric representations. So when they shared their information and then came to the roundtables in the afternoon, what I think a lot of the researchers heard is, we like what you're saying, and the arts educators were very excited about it. But by and large, what came out of that roundtable was that teachers said, our kids are never going to get the level of art instruction that your subjects had in your studies. And even if they're getting art in schools, even if schools haven't cut the arts, and so many have, it's ridiculous, but even if they're getting art in school, they're probably not getting the dosage that you're testing. So they then became interested in how about studying what happens when classroom teachers are embedding arts-based activities into instruction, something that's known as arts integration. So we decided then at Hopkins, what really came out of that is that's where the research needs to be. That's kind of how we take that basic research and see what it looks like in instruction, in classroom. So we started looking at the literature, and we found that that there was some literature that shows that arts integration does support transfer of knowledge and helps kids draw connections and encourages collaborations. And we said, you know what, there may be another benefit. So what we found is that there was a wide variety of factors that improved memory, but a number of these factors were really naturally a part of various forms of arts activity. So therefore, we believe that maybe arts integration as a technique actually could naturally enhance retention. And so here are the memory effects that we researched. You can see some of those studies go way back and some are more recent. Rehearsing, elaborating information, generating information, when information is enacted, when we have to struggle with something, effort after meaning, when we are emotionally aroused, and that when we see something, we remember it better, even when, better than verbal, even when the test is verbal. So we looked at all these studies and we thought, okay, so taken together, you know, could arts really recruit those memory effects? So we did a randomized trial with 100 students in a Baltimore City school, and we developed 5th grade units in ecology and astronomy. One version was conventional, and the other incorporated an artistic activity. They were pretty tightly matched. No, they were very tightly matched for timing, for content, the exact same content, the exact same amount of time. Even the order of presentation was matched. It was matched whether it was a group activity or an individual activity. So it was really pretty tightly matched. Here's how we designed the study. So each group of randomized students received 1 unit taught through arts integration and 1 through conventional. So that red group represents a group of randomized kids that got astronomy through teacher 1 and then environmental science through teacher 4. And then every teacher taught both conditions in that one subject. So we controlled for teacher effect. We had observers in the classrooms 60% of the time to make sure the units were being taught as designed. Here's some examples. Here they explained the Big Bang. Here they acted it out. Here they used a diagram to trace the galaxy shapes, and here they used dance movements. Here they used, again, dance movements. Here they described it verbally in journals, and here they drew pictures of the galaxy shapes. And then here, again, they expanded on vocabulary through their own words, and here they sketched. So what we believed, here's some pictures. Actually, we then expanded this study. I'm going to show you the results of our preliminary study. We expanded it with a grant from IES. Thank you, Aaron Higgins. So we are now collecting data for not 4 classrooms, but 16 classrooms with 300 kids. And not 2 units, but 4, completely matched the same way. So here's an example of a chemistry unit. They're showing through Tableau what the molecules in a solid would look like, and that they're showing what a liquid would look like and what the molecules in gas would look like. And here they're depicting a wave. All I could say was, don't drop her. Here they're storyboarding instead of writing out. They're creating a storyboard for how an asteroid goes to a meteorite. Here they're using non-renewable and renewable resources, and as it turns out, the non-renewable resources were very simple and elegant at first, but they fell over because there weren't enough resources there. Here they're drawing about the greenhouse effect, and I love this. The Earth, this is the hot Earth with 10 blankets on it to show the greenhouse effect. So, what did we find? We found no difference in learning between treatment and control. That is, at post-test, all groups performed the same way. So they learned the same amount of information. We predicted that. But in delayed testing, we see 2.5 months later, as we predicted, that the students, the art integrated condition, produced better retention. And when we started teasing out kids in terms of their reading, we found that the biggest jump were for kids at the basic level of reading. So this is the control condition, and this is the arts integrated condition, which makes sense because children who have reading difficulties had a chance to express what they knew through a different way and to learn through a different way. So we promote arts integration, obviously, and we hope that we see the same results with this pilot study that we're doing, and we hope that others will replicate this since we have these tightly controlled units all ready to go. So the next target is moving information from just knowing it to then applying it meaningfully. And when I hear teachers talk about should we have teach to mastery or should we have children do projects, the answer is it's not one or the other. Should we do phonics or whole language? It's not one or the other. Should we teach math skills or do application? It's not one or the other. You know, we have to stop thinking that way in education and polarizing what we do and try to really be a little bit better at melding these together. So we draw on some of the research on creative thinking and problem solving, and there's a growing body of research about how the brain acts differently. I love Charles Lim's study. This is Your Brain on Jazz, where he showed difference between musicians that had memorized a piece versus musicians who were doing, versus when they were doing it in a scanner in improvisation. And he found similar results with rap musicians. So we know that something's happening differently. And again, teachers are very interested in reading the research on creativity. And so we really have them think about not having children just answer one question, but focusing more on divergent kinds of thinking in real-world context. And then finally, we draw on, for evaluating learning, we draw on the research from more recent research, Hassler and Rodiger and Carpecki and Butler, who have done work in feedback and active retrieval and spacing. Teachers are reading the studies, and then, you know, again, I think understanding the importance of feedback and the importance of frequent and useful and scaffolded feedback is something that they can go back and try in their classrooms. You know, yes, they haven't replicated this work in randomized trials over and over again, and yet still learning that study, why not go back and use feedback the right way, right? Why not? You know, the work of Carpegate and Rodiger in active retrieval of information, often called the testing effect. Well, you don't have to quiz kids every day, but the whole point of the research was that students need to know that if they can actively retrieve information, it's much better for them than passive studying. So, do we need randomized trials on that? Maybe, but let's just go ahead and try it out now and see if it works. Same thing with spacing. You know, I think that I'd like to see really researched more than it is. And certainly researched in randomized trials, but you know, once teachers read this research, it's really okay if they try to give kids space out retrieval practice for kids and you know, do their own action research and see if that retrieval practice actually produces better retention and better results. So, you know, here's an example of having a teacher really think about all of this, and in this, she's using the ubiquitous mid-chapter review to measure students' ability to estimate length and to use perimeter and area. And here she says, imagine a farm and think about the animals you want on your farm and draw pens, and then decide the size you want of your pens, and then give them a rubric so that they know what they're looking for. So that's kind of in a nutshell the 6 areas that we work with teachers, again bringing them the research studies behind them and have them consider how that could inform educational best practices. And a few of the references there, and so that's the work I do and what we bring to teachers. So I think we have time now just to chew on this a little bit. Yep. Okay.
Questions? Please use the microphone.
Oh, good. Ask Bob the questions. No? Okay.
I'm finding this very refreshing. I enjoy the idea that you've got brain research from a broad base and that you're going in and looking at how the teacher attitudes are shifting. I'm curious about the reaction that teachers have around neuromyths when they're exposed, and wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more about how you bring teachers to the point where they begin to understand that this is indeed a neuromyth and that the tentacles of neuromyths can be deep for their own teaching, and how you help them start to extract them.
That's a great question. You know, so the left-right brain is one that unfortunately many teachers believe. You know, again, as we heard this morning, and they're making decisions about it. They think that they're supposed to, again, go home and think about how they develop the different sides of the brain. Yeah, so a lot of them are shocked to see it. You know, we show them the anatomy, we show them that yes, while the brain is localized for many functions, unless your corpus callosum severed, you're probably using your whole brain for most tasks. And you know, so it's relief, frankly, that you know that they realize that. You know, the one about using 10% of the brain, I still hear that. I mean, it's in the public domain still. And so, I don't know, some of that they just laugh at. You know, I just ask them to consider what the other 90% of the brain's probably doing most of the time, right? You know, as I said, the one on, they read about multitasking. Some of the good work of Steve Yantis, right at Hopkins. He's done a lot of work on multitasking, and the problem of switching between modalities, the cost involved, right, in task switching. So it makes them really consider, you know, how they make kids multitask, and you know, so yeah, I think that it evokes a lot of thought and discussion. When we talk about the learning styles, that's the one that shocks them the most. And some of them actually get angry because they have bought into this. It's like, how dare you tell me that that's not what I should be doing. And they think that we're telling them they shouldn't differentiate. So that usually then brings in discussion about, well, what is differentiation? And yes, you should differentiate, but you don't need to differentiate because you think if somebody's a visual or an auditory learner. You know, then we get into ways that differentiation is important, right? Prior knowledge, their achievement levels. I mean, there are multiple ways that differentiation occurs. So, yeah. But thanks, good question. And I think, actually, just to end that, that I think a lot of what we see in our results come from teachers really now not being driven by those myths. You know, I think that that really helps them the most feel confident that they have the strategies to do what they have to do.
Can I do a quick follow-up related? Your sense that it's that reduction in neuromyth faith, let's say, your sense that that is part of what drives the classroom changes, is that, do you have measures that let you get at how their teaching might change related to that reduction? Or is it more a sense of those are the aha moments in the sessions and it's...
I think it's more those are the aha moments. What we do collect, and of course a lot of it's self-reports, and I know that that's a little tricky. Some people think observations are better. Having been a principal for so long, I can tell you that what a teacher does every day is not the same thing as what's done when somebody's sitting in the back of their classroom. So I'm not so sure that somebody observing instruction, even over a period of time, is any better than an anonymous self-report. But we'd love to be able to do cameras and coding and you know, really start getting deeper and deeper into how their practices do change. But for now, we ask them to do, it's their exit ticket to our training. So we ask them to do some pretty extensive reflections and on each of the targets, and you know, what's worked for them, what hasn't, what parts of their practice changed related to each of those targets. I have to tell you, the one that comes up the most in terms of making a difference in their practice and that they'd never stop doing ever again is giving kids concept maps at the beginning, you know, thinking about bigger picture thinking. A lot of it's arts integration, that a lot of them were afraid to do that, and once they started, they realized that kids were being engaged more. I think Martha talked about that earlier. It produces kind of more of an enjoyment. A lot of teachers see that. I saw it as I observed our study. Not 100% of the arts integrated units used arts integration. Probably about 65% of the conventional activities were converted to arts integrated. So I would sit there and watch the kids doing kind of conventional stuff, reading from a textbook or watching a PowerPoint, and then the art activity would start, and those kids that have been sitting there like this or chatting with each other, when the art activity started, boy, were they engaged. It was just phenomenal to see in school after school and classroom after classroom how that happened. So teachers would report on that. Yeah. A lot of them reported we used some of the work of Carol Dweck in terms of in Brain Target 1 about establishing the right mindsets for learning. And so a lot of them are really interested in that work. A lot of them don't know her work. It's not always taught in teacher preparation programs. So just praising for effort, they see a big difference in that. A lot of them are doing their own action research. Within that target, we talk about different ways of management. Some of them are doing research on PBIS, which is kind of a, positive behavior intervention, in which kids get rewards for everything they do, versus responsive classroom, where it's really more intrinsic rewards, not extrinsic. So, you know, the teachers in our program do a capstone project, and so they pick one area and then they do research on it. So they're telling us then too what they see is working and not working. A lot of them are very interested, again, this is under the umbrella of Brain Target 1 that we teach, in the research on mindfulness training, because there's a growing body of research on that. Hopkins is doing some of it, but there's a lot on it, and showing how it's increasing regulation, self-regulation, right? Attending behaviors. So one of my students just last semester had 2 classes where she used some of the techniques of mindfulness training on one class and didn't use it on another, and you know, reported some really interesting results. Again, just action research that she's tinkering with on her own. Yeah, so we get a lot of very detailed information from them about what they're using and how they see it's changing their practice.
So are you getting a lot of attention from teachers? I would imagine they would be interested all over the country, but they might not know about this. Are you getting interest from those who are training the teachers? And what's available to them? Are there modules that they can download, that kind of thing?
So if they want to pay Hopkins tuition, they can study with us. And you know, we, in our 5-course certificate, they learn this model first. They're reading this research because it's really a broad array of topics, right? And it gets them thinking about practice right away. And then they go into the other courses, bring them deeper into the specific research, you know, cognitive development, and then Martha's course, neurobiology of learning differences, and then reading and literacy and numeracy, cognitive processes. Then they end with the capstone, where, as I just described, they take one area that they're very interested in and do a deep lit review, and then they try their own intervention, and they come back then and report that. So that's if they want to come and study with me. However, newly released is a professional development online module, and it's in a company called EduPlanet 21. And this was just launched, and so there are teachers now piloting that. And it's kind of a social learning network too. They get a chance to dialogue, so there are people in different parts. We're piloting it actually with our schools in CSOS, the Center for Social Organization of Schools. There's a cluster of them that are piloting that as an online professional development. So, and actually we're doing efficacy research on that too. We're doing pre-post. We just trained 200 teachers in Puerto Rico, and we collected data for that. We haven't started analyzing that yet. But so we're looking at different configurations. That was 21 hours of training across a weekend. We don't think that we're going to see results because we think that's too tight of a time frame. We saw differences when we spread the training out over the course of a year or a semester to when it was only 2 weeks, which was one of our summer cohorts. So we think 3 days is probably not enough, but we'll see. So yes, so that, you know, we've done professional development. We've been offering it to Baltimore City schools. They get MSDE credits with it, so it's a little bit of a carrot. And now it's online, pretty inexpensive for a teacher could do it or a school could sign up. So yeah, trying to get the work out there. And you know, again, I think that with the help of my good friend researchers like Jay and the support and Martha and others, it's really good for us as educators to bounce ideas off of them and have them help us parse what is usable and what we should be ignoring. And I think being really purposeful in how we apply the science and making sure that we know that it hasn't been replicated 100 times, but we can still benefit from these findings. I think that's how we get it out there. Question?
Yeah, I'm Mary Ann Gorman with the George Washington University. I'm just wondering, you spoke a little bit about teacher efficacy beliefs and how they changed as a result of teacher training. And you also spoke a little bit about mindfulness training. I'm just wondering if you looked at changes in student efficacy beliefs when they learned a little bit about how their brains learn,
You know, we haven't done that research, but there is starting to be some research in student beliefs out there. So there are some studies, but there is a study we are hoping to do right now, and we're doing a little preliminary work in a DC school actually, where we are looking at cortisol levels of students and teachers, and also collecting surveys, stress surveys, and efficacy surveys of students and teachers, and just seeing if we see biological correlation with reported stress. The intervention we're looking at it's actually a charter school designed for the school to be kind of that protective environment. So we want to kind of move that into a bigger domain and look to see if this training helps also provide kind of that protective environment for kids. You know, the idea here is that one factor that reduces that toxic stress the most is the protection of caring adults. And what we know about school environments is that many of them contribute to toxic stress for kids, contribute to the stress rather than protect it from it. And so, you know, the idea here is, so how do we put together school structures that that will reduce and protect students from stress. So that's some of the work that we're doing now. Doug Granger was at Hopkins and is now at Arizona State University. So we're collaborating with our School of Public Health and Doug to start to put together some studies that we actually can do in schools and start looking at student efficacy and teacher efficacy and, you know, what promotes it. And you know, again, I probably failed to say, and I should, and maybe this is a good place to end, or another question, okay, not end yet, is that why would we worry about teacher efficacy? It actually is a construct that is very tightly correlated with and even predictive of student achievement. So it's important and been long researched.
Just so many things come to mind, but one of them, we've been talking about how to get neuroscientists into the schools, and we usually focus on the students. And you know, do you think teachers would be receptive to being scanned in terms of could we identify good teachers with brain imaging? Maybe they're more empathetic. Maybe they're better able to identify, you know, emotional states of children. Yeah, because a lot of teaching isn't just how much knowledge; it's connecting. And I actually think that. You know, you could probably not focus on students, but also teachers, but I don't know if they would be offended, you know, by...
Jay, if you want to put together that study, I'll find you teachers.
I mean, at some point you'd probably want to identify like good and really good teachers, which might be a little tricky to kind of navigate that, but just a different twist. And the final thing, I like the feedback part in terms of spacing and how frequently and stuff, I would expect that to be age sensitive, so that the actual frequencies, you know, might be quite different for a third grader, a sixth grader, a high school student, and probably something that could be accessible in terms of looking at you know, different frequencies of feedback and see if it's useful at different ages.
Frequency and spacing, exactly. Yeah, and that would be interesting to know if developmentally that changes. And, you know, so I think we're only at the beginning of understanding how that research might inform practice. But I think teachers just knowing about those studies is the first step. You know, teachers understanding that you know, it has been replicated a few times and in the labs, so let's try it and see, does it work, does it not work? Does it work for some students, does it not work for others? And, you know, again, we in our programs really encourage teachers to be constantly thinking of themselves as researchers. you know, that teaching is, you know, you shouldn't just listen to us and do what we tell you because we tell you to do it, you know. You should be out there looking at your students and testing all the time what works for them. And then looking at Bob Slavin's What Works website and IES's and see what else is out there that's researched. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you again for the discussion.
Thank you so much. That fits in very well, and I think it also sets up very well the next panel, which will begin in about 20 minutes. Please be back here in the auditorium. We're going to take a quick coffee break. There are some snacks out in the hall there, and be back by 2:45. Thank you.